Evidently, there just wasn't enough anti-Muslim hysteria created by the opponents of the downtown Manhattan Islamic Community Center. Now, Congressman Peter King, one of its most vocal critics, has a really great idea. In our fourth story, the Republican congressman from New York wants to open a House inquiry into the so-called radicalization of the Muslim community in America. And he will be able to do just that when he becomes the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee. Congressman King claims that, quote, "When I meet with law enforcement officials, they are constantly telling me how little cooperation they get from Muslim leaders." Right. That's why we heard the story just a few weeks ago of how the work of an undercover FBI informant in Irvine, California came to a swift end. Why? Because the Muslim community he was trying to infiltrate was so shocked by the informant's talk of jihad that they actually obtained a restraining order against him. That informant, Craig Montiel, is also now suing the FBI, claiming that he was trained to entrap Muslims. The informant was also a convicted forger. It almost goes without saying that the Muslim community in California was offended because a certain degree of trust between law enforcement and Muslim Americans is absolutely vital. Indeed, 10 terror plots have been foiled with the help of the Muslim American community since October 2001, according to a report from the Muslim Public Affairs Council. But Congressman King doesn't seem to be aware of that. This is what he said in late October after making the pro forma statement that the overwhelming majority of Muslims are good people.
It's not just people who are involved with the terrorists or the extremists. It's people who are in mainstream Islam, leaders of mosques, leaders of Muslim organizations who do not come forward and officially denounce or officially cooperate with the police against those who are extremists and terrorists. So it goes beyond the terrorists and the extremists, and it also includes those in what others call mainstream Muslim leadership.
As for Congressman King's proposed hearings, the executive director of the Muslim Public Affairs Council expressed obvious concern. He basically wants to treat the Muslim American community as a suspect community. Joining me now, Zahra, Billoo, the executive director of the San Francisco Bay office of the Council on American-Islamic Relations. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So Congressman King has also said that he will seek the opinions of Muslim leaders, so these hearings won't be one-sided. I'm wondering, how persuaded are you by that?
Unfortunately, not persuaded at all. Congressman King has a history of selecting and screening individuals who are going to reinforce his predetermined conclusions. And so I hope these hearings don't happen, but that if they do, he'll actually utilize legitimate mainstream American Muslim voices that are recognizable by the American Muslim community and can speak on their behalf, as opposed to a hand-picked group of anti-Muslim and anti-Islam individuals.
You know, what's interesting about this, I mean, aside from the fact it's sort of obviously demagogic in intention, is the fact that, you know, everything you read about the sort of problems of in Europe, right, and mosques and radical mosques in the UK have to do with a sort of alienation that's grown up between certain subsections of Muslim communities in Europe and the state and authorities. And that alienation seems to generally not be the case in the U.S. Is that your sense of the kind of status quo?
Absolutely. Is that time and again, as you mentioned, you know, just a second ago, was that the American Muslim community has shown a willingness to cooperate with law enforcement. FBI Director Robert Mueller has testified about this before Congress. So has LA County Sheriff Lee Baca, that they've said over and over again that Muslims are cooperating across the country. Now, if Congressman King is concerned about organizations like CAIR advising American Muslims of their civil rights, I would argue that he has a misunderstanding of what it means to be a patriotic individual.
What's your sense? I mean, given the fact that we had this whole craziness around the Park 51 Community Center in New York this summer, we see this with King, and we've seen, I feel like, an increase in this sort of rhetoric, particularly from the right and Republicans. What is your sense of what is driving that, and where do you think this is headed, and how can we cut it off? Three questions.
You know, I would argue that Representative King is a perfect example of what is driving that. We see this with the sort of his fueling the rhetoric around the New York controversy and how he was willing to use that for his own political gain. And my concern is that this is headed towards the Red Scare era and towards, you know, McCarthyism. What's to stop this from becoming the next House on American Activities Committee hearing, right? Like, this sounds like a witch hunt to me.
I'm wondering also, if there's anything to, I don't think there's anything to this radicalization, but at the same time that this kind of rhetoric is escalating, do you think there is a sort of alienation that is beginning to develop, or do you think there's a possibility of a kind of blowback in which the alienation itself sort of precipitates a reaction in which there is this sort of breakdown in trust?
Right. I mean, I think that if Congressman King goes forward with these hearings, and if he uses anti-Islam and anti-Muslim experts to legitimize his own personal views for his own political gain, absolutely, the alienation will be exacerbated by this, right? Is that American Muslims are saying time and again, we want to work with you, we want to cooperate. We see them reporting instances of concern in Irvine, but also, for example, the New York Times Square incident, where the first person to report that bomber was a Muslim street merchant. But if this continues with individuals like Congressman King saying, we don't want to work with you, we want to, treat you as a suspect class, then the concern is that the divide will become aggravated and that cooperation will be undermined. And then who's safer?
Zahra Billoo from the Council on American-Islamic Relations, I really appreciate your time tonight.
Thanks for having me.